By early 1918, the war had stopped pretending it was going to end cleanly. There were no fresh illusions left, no speeches about decisive breakthroughs or quick victories. What remained was calculation and fear. Commanders looked at maps that no longer promised opportunity, only risk. Every option carried cost. Every delay carried consequence. Time itself had become the enemy. For Germany, the clock was ticking loudly. The Eastern Front had vanished, freeing divisions that could finally be used in the West. But something else was arriving just as quickly: American troops, fresh, numerous, and increasingly impossible to ignore. The window was narrow: strike now or lose the chance forever. For the Allies, the situation was no less dangerous. Years of attrition had drained reserves. Armies were holding, but barely. Morale was brittle. Another shock, another collapse could unravel everything they had endured. This was not a year of confidence. It was a year of necessity. Across the front lines, officers and soldiers sensed it. The war had to be decided now, not because conditions were favorable, but because they were no longer sustainable. The question was not who would win comfortably. The question was who would break first. And breaking did not always look like defeat. It could look like exhaustion, like hesitation, like systems failing quietly until they failed all at once. Fresh American troops were entering a battlefield shaped by years of survival. They brought numbers, energy, and hope, but they were stepping into a war that no longer operated on optimism. Veterans understood that momentum could not be trusted, that success was temporary, that every advance risked collapse. This imbalance between renewal and exhaustion defined 1918. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 13. In this episode, we follow the war's final year, not as a steady march toward peace, but as a sequence of breaking points. We'll examine the last great gamble launched in the spring, the fragile responses that followed, and the way collapse replaced conquest as the war's defining outcome. Because the final year of the war was not about control. It was about discovering whether control still existed at all. By the opening months of 1918, the war had reached a strange and dangerous equilibrium. On the Western Front, the stalemate still held. Trench systems stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border, layered and reinforced after years of adaptation. The ground itself had changed, churned, cratered, stripped of landmarks, but the structure of the war remained grimly familiar. Attacks still consumed thousands of lives for limited gains. Defense still favored endurance over maneuver. Nothing about the front suggested an easy way forward, only persistence. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. To the east, the war had effectively vanished. Russia's exit following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk removed an entire front almost overnight. German divisions that had been tied down for years could now be redeployed west, giving Berlin a brief and dangerous sense of opportunity. For the first time since 1914, Germany could concentrate forces without immediately fearing collapse elsewhere. But that concentration came with urgency. The Eastern Front did not disappear because Germany achieved decisive victory. It disappeared because Russia collapsed internally. That distinction mattered. Germany gained time and manpower, but not stability. The war's pressures had not been solved. They had simply been relocated. At sea, pressure continued to tighten. Britain's blockade restricted the flow of food and raw materials into Germany, turning civilian life into a daily struggle. Calories fell. Substitutes replaced staples. Hunger became routine. This was not a dramatic weapon. It did not announce itself with explosions. It worked slowly, invisibly, eroding physical health and political patience at the same time. The naval war did not kill quickly. It exhausted quietly. Manpower revealed the same pattern. Germany had mobilized more than 13 million men since the war began. By early 1918, over 2 million were dead, and millions more were wounded or unfit for service. The army still existed, but its composition had changed. Elite units remained, but they were surrounded by formations filled with younger recruits, older reservists, and soldiers worn thin by years of combat. France had paid an even steeper price relative to its population. Nearly every community had lost sons. Casualties approached 1.5 million dead, with millions more wounded. The army endured, but the margin for further loss was dangerously narrow. The war had become existential, not ideological. Britain's losses, too, were immense. The volunteer armies of 1914 had been consumed. Conscription had followed. By 1918, British forces were holding their ground, but only through constant adaptation and sacrifice across a global empire. And into this exhausted system came something new. The United States had mobilized millions, but its losses were still comparatively light. American troops were arriving in growing numbers, inexperienced, but fresh. They did not yet decide battles, but they changed calculations. They represented time, and Germany was running out of it. This imbalance defined early 1918. Germany had one advantage: initiative. The Allies had one advantage: endurance. Across all sides, casualty figures framed decision-making, whether leaders admitted it or not. Tens of millions of men had been mobilized since the war began. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded, missing, or permanently altered. Entire societies functioned with absence baked into daily life. Loss was no longer shocking. It was expected. And yet, despite this staggering cost, the war had not delivered a decision. No capital had fallen. No army had been destroyed outright. No settlement had been forced. The systems sustaining the war were damaged, but still operating. That was the danger. The war had consumed nearly everything available to fight it: manpower, resources, belief, but it had not yet answered the central question of who would prevail. And unresolved wars do not drift toward peace. They accelerate toward risk. Early 1918 was not a moment of confidence for any side. It was a moment of calculation, driven by the understanding that what came next would likely decide the outcome one way or another. The war had reached the point where something had to give. And what Germany chose to do next was shaped entirely by that reality. By early 1918, German leadership understood something with brutal clarity. This was the last chance. For nearly 4 years, Germany had fought a war of endurance. It was not built to win indefinitely. The British blockade tightened month by month. Civilian morale frayed. Food shortages were no longer temporary disruptions. They were structural conditions. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American manpower loomed like a rising tide that could not be stopped, only delayed. Germany did not need victory in the abstract. It needed victory now. The collapse of Russia created an opening that had not existed before. With the Eastern Front gone, nearly 50 divisions could be shifted west. On paper, this produced a momentary advantage in numbers. More importantly, it produced a psychological opening, a sense that initiative had returned. German planners believed the war could still be decided if they acted before American forces arrived in decisive strength. The offensive they envisioned was not defensive. It was not cautious. It was a gamble. The plan was built around speed, surprise, and disruption rather than territory. Traditional frontal assaults had failed too many times. Instead, German commanders embraced a new approach centered on infiltration. Specially trained stormtrooper units would bypass strongpoints, penetrate weak sectors, and collapse the enemy's rear before coherent resistance could form. This was not improvisation. It was adaptation. Artillery preparation would be brief but intense, designed to blind and disorient rather than pulverize. Gas shells would suppress command posts. Communications would be shattered. Infantry would move fast, exploiting confusion rather than waiting for formal objectives. The goal was not to seize ground methodically. The goal was to break the Allied system. German leadership believed that if they could fracture British and French coordination even temporarily, the psychological shock might prove decisive. A breakthrough did not need to reach Paris. It only needed to convince the Allies that continued resistance was futile. This belief rested on several assumptions. First, that Allied morale was already near collapse. Years of attrition, mutinies in the French army the year before, and civilian exhaustion suggested fragility. Second, that American forces would not arrive quickly enough or in sufficient readiness to matter immediately. And third, that Germany's own troops still possessed the cohesion and discipline necessary to sustain offensive momentum. Each assumption contained truth. Each assumption carried risk. The offensive, known later as the Spring Offensive, was not a single attack, but a sequence of blows designed to keep the Allies off balance. German commanders intended to strike where defenses were weakest, forcing constant reaction rather than organized response. When the offensive began in March, the initial results seemed to confirm German hopes. Allied lines buckled under the sudden weight of concentrated assault. British units in particular were pushed back rapidly in some sectors, retreating farther in days than they had in years. Communications failed. Headquarters lost contact with frontline units. Confusion spread. For a moment, the war felt fluid again. German troops advanced across ground that had been static since 1914. Villages changed hands. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. The sense of motion itself became intoxicating. But even as momentum built, cracks were already forming. The offensive demanded speed, but speed strained supply lines. Advancing troops outpaced food, ammunition, and artillery support. Units grew exhausted almost as quickly as they advanced. Elite stormtroopers, the backbone of the assault, suffered disproportionate casualties, weakening the very force Germany could least afford to lose. And critically, the offensive lacked a clear end state. German commanders knew how to begin the attack. They were less certain how to finish it. There was no single decisive objective, no capital to seize, no army to encircle completely. Instead, success depended on the Allies collapsing psychologically before Germany exhausted itself physically. That was the gamble. The Spring Offensive was built on the belief that shock could substitute for sustainability, that disruption could replace destruction, and that time briefly could be bent in Germany's favor. For a few weeks, it almost worked. But wars decided by momentum alone are unforgiving. They require success not just at the point of contact, but across logistics, command, morale, and endurance simultaneously. Germany had designed an offensive for a narrow window. What it could not control was how quickly that window would close. And that realization, still distant, still unclear, was already shaping what came next. For a brief moment in the spring of 1918, Germany did something it had not done in years. It made the Western Front move. Allied lines bent. Trench systems were overrun. Retreats happened in daylight. Maps were redrawn. The sense of momentum of possibility returned to German headquarters and to German soldiers who had spent years measuring progress in yards. But wars are not decided by motion. They are decided by what motion produces and what it costs. The Spring Offensive did not fail because German troops lacked skill or courage. In many places, they fought with extraordinary effectiveness, using infiltration tactics that exposed the rigidity of Allied defenses. The offensive did not fail because the plan was foolish on its own terms. It failed because tactical brilliance cannot compensate for structural limits indefinitely. The first limit was logistics. German troops advanced faster than their supply systems could follow. The Western Front was not open countryside with clean roads and functioning railways. It was a shattered landscape, cratered by years of shelling, filled with destroyed bridges, broken track, and ruined villages that offered little usable infrastructure. Every mile forward extended the supply line into terrain that resisted movement. Railways mattered most because railways were the arteries of industrial war. In defensive warfare, Germany could stockpile close to the line. In offensive warfare, that stockpile needed to move forward, and moving it required intact tracks, working engines, reliable timetables, and fuel. The offensive outran all of that. Food grew scarce. Ammunition deliveries lagged. Artillery support became uneven. Units advanced into positions where they could see success, but could not sustain it. This created a cruel contradiction. The offensive demanded speed to prevent Allied reorganization, but speed depleted the very strength needed to continue. German soldiers marched through mud and shell holes with heavy packs, carrying what they could because they could not count on resupply. They fought hard, then fought again, then moved again, and exhaustion accumulated faster than victory. The second limit was command. In an offensive built on disruption, control becomes fragile. German tactics depended on small units moving quickly, bypassing strong points, and exploiting gaps. That approach produced rapid advances, but it also created uneven front lines, with pockets of resistance behind advancing troops and confusing gaps between units. Communication was difficult under the best conditions. Under bombardment, with shattered wires and chaotic movement, it became unreliable. Commanders struggled to keep an accurate picture of the battlefield. Orders arrived late or not at all. Coordination between infantry and artillery broke down. Some units advanced too far without support. Others hesitated because they could not see what neighboring units were doing. This was not incompetence. It was the nature of modern war once movement returns. The third limit was strategic purpose. Germany could begin the offensive brilliantly, but it did not have a single clear objective that could convert success into decision. A breakthrough is only decisive if it destroys an enemy army, seizes a critical political center, or forces a collapse that cannot be stabilized. In 1918, Germany's offensive threatened the Allies, but it did not break them in one stroke. Part of this was geography. The Allies had depth. They could retreat and regroup. Their rail networks, while strained, still allowed repositioning. Part of it was politics. Britain and France could not afford to quit, because quitting would mean defeat, occupation, or humiliation. And part of it was the war's own logic. After 4 years of attrition, the Allied system was designed to absorb shock. It bent, sometimes alarmingly, but it did not snap, because snapping had been what everyone feared since 1914. Germany's plan depended on the Allies collapsing psychologically. But psychological collapse is not a lever you can pull. It is an outcome you hope for, and hope is not strategy. The fourth limit was human cost. The spring offensive relied on elite assault troops, stormtroopers trained for infiltration and rapid movement. These units were highly effective, but they were also irreplaceable. Germany did not have endless reserves of trained, motivated, physically capable soldiers. Years of war had already consumed the best of each cohort. As the offensive continued, those elite units took disproportionate losses. Even when they succeeded at a cost Germany could not afford. This is one of the most important dynamics of the offensive. Germany's initial advantages were real, but they were also finite. Every day of fighting spent them. And while Germany was spending its best troops, the Allies were gaining something Germany could not match: time. Time allowed coordination, time allowed reinforcements, time allowed the integration of growing American forces into the broader Allied system, even if American units were still inexperienced. Time allowed commanders to adjust and to strengthen weak sectors. As the offensive progressed, the Allies began to stabilize. They did not stabilize because the situation was easy. They stabilized because they were forced to, because retreat without end would become catastrophe, and because the machinery of alliance, imperfect, strained, but functioning, began to coordinate more effectively. This was the strategic reality Germany could not escape. The Allies could lose ground and still continue fighting. Germany could not. Germany had launched the offensive because it believed time was running out. And the offensive proved that belief correct. It gained ground, but it spent the reserves it needed to keep fighting. When momentum stalled, it did not stall all at once. It slowed. Units advanced less quickly. Resistance stiffened. Supplies became harder to move. Casualties mounted. The sense of inevitable breakthrough faded. German troops began to occupy ground that looked like victory on a map, but felt like exposure on the ground. Salients formed protrusions into Allied territory that invited counterattacks. Positions became harder to defend. The offensive created new fronts to hold, new supply demands, new vulnerabilities. The war was not ending. It was expanding. And behind the front, the home front continued to deteriorate. Hunger did not pause because the army advanced. The blockade did not loosen because trenches moved. Civilian hardship continued to intensify, and political strain continued to build. This is where the spring offensive becomes tragic in a specific way. Germany did not lack intelligence. It did not lack tactical innovation. It did not lack courage. It lacked time and sustainability, and those are not problems you can solve with daring. Tactical brilliance was trapped inside strategic impossibility. Germany could win battles. It could not win the war quickly enough. And once that became clear, the offensive's deeper consequence emerged. Germany had spent what it could not replace. The last reserves of trained men, the last reserves of morale, the last reserves of initiative. When the Allies began their counteroffensives, they would do so against an enemy that had not simply failed. It had exhausted itself. The spring offensive, for all its drama, did not produce decision, but it did something else. It revealed that the war's final year would not be decided by clever plans alone, but by which system could endure one more shock without collapsing. If the spring offensive revealed Germany's limits, it also forced the Allies to confront a hard truth of their own. They could no longer afford disunity. For much of the war, the Allied side had been exactly that, a coalition rather than a single force. Britain and France coordinated, but often uneasily. National priorities competed. Command structures overlapped. Decisions were negotiated rather than enforced. In a war of attrition, this inefficiency had been survivable. In a war suddenly defined by movement again, it was dangerous. The shock of the German offensive made this unmistakably clear. As Allied lines bent and retreated in the spring of 1918, the risk was not just territorial loss, it was fragmentation. If British and French forces responded separately, Germany might still achieve what it needed, not a decisive battlefield victory, but a political rupture between allies who could no longer coordinate under pressure. Out of that danger came one of the most consequential Allied decisions of the war. For the first time, overall coordination on the Western Front was placed under a single commander, Ferdinand Foch. His appointment was not a moment of triumph. It was a concession to necessity. National pride gave way to survival. Foch's role was not to invent a miracle solution. It was to impose coherence. He coordinated reserves across national lines, shifting units where pressure was greatest rather than where politics preferred them to stay. British divisions reinforced French sectors. French units stabilized British lines. The front became elastic rather than rigid, able to bend without breaking. This shift mattered more than any single tactic. Elastic defense accepted temporary retreat as the price of survival. Rather than holding every trench at all costs, Allied forces prioritized cohesion, preservation of manpower, and the ability to counterattack when German momentum slowed. This was not a moral change. It was a practical one. Years of experience had taught Allied commanders something Germany was learning too late. Ground could be retaken. Destroyed armies could not. Counterattacks became selective and deliberate. Instead of grand offensives designed to achieve immediate breakthroughs, the Allies focused on disrupting German units that had advanced too far, isolating salients, and forcing Germany to defend extended lines with exhausted troops. The goal was not immediate victory. The goal was survival long enough for Germany's offensive energy to burn itself out. At the same time, the balance of manpower was shifting. American forces were arriving in steadily increasing numbers. Early in 1918, their presence was more symbolic than decisive. Many American units lacked experience. Training continued, even as some formations were rushed forward to fill gaps. Command relationships were still being negotiated. But symbolism matters in war. For Allied soldiers, American arrivals represented relief, not necessarily immediate reinforcement, but the promise that the line would not run out of men. For German planners, the same arrivals represented dread. Every week that passed made the original gamble of the spring offensive more questionable. The Allies understood this asymmetry. They did not need to win immediately. They needed to endure. Foch coordination allowed the Allies to absorb German blows without panicking. When sectors collapsed, reserves moved. When lines bent too far, counterattacks restored balance. The front stabilized not because pressure disappeared, but because response became systematic rather than improvised. This was endurance translated into structure. It also reflected a deeper psychological shift. For years, Allied strategy had been haunted by the fear of collapse, of losing nerve, of losing cohesion, of being forced into a bad peace. By 1918, that fear still existed, but it was tempered by a grim confidence born of survival. The Allies had endured Verdun. They had endured the Somme. They had endured years of attrition and blockade and internal strain. They did not need to prove superiority. They needed to avoid catastrophe. Germany, by contrast, had placed everything on the hope of rapid success. When that success stalled, the strategic balance shifted decisively, even if the battlefield situation remained fluid. As German attacks slowed, Allied commanders recognized what was happening. Germany had spent its last reserves. Elite units were depleted. Replacements were fewer and less trained. Supply problems worsened rather than improved. The offensive that was meant to decide the war had instead revealed the limits of Germany's endurance. The Allies responded accordingly. They avoided overextension. They conserved strength. They planned not for immediate glory, but for sustained pressure. American forces were integrated gradually rather than thrown into premature offensives. Training continued even as combat experience accumulated. This patience was deliberate. Allied leaders understood that the war's final phase would not be won by a single blow. It would be won by maintaining cohesion while Germany's ability to resist eroded from multiple directions: military, economic, and political. Endurance became advantage because endurance could now be measured. Germany's margin for error was gone. Every failed attack cost something it could not replace. Every week of fighting deepened civilian hardship at home. Every delay allowed American manpower to grow more relevant. The Allies did not need a miracle. They needed time. And for the first time since 1914, time was no longer neutral. It favored them. The war was not over. Fighting would continue and losses would remain horrific. But the strategic balance had shifted in a way that no single battlefield map could fully capture. Germany had made its last great gamble. The Allies had survived it. What followed would not be a sudden collapse, but a steady unraveling, driven by the same forces that had sustained the war for years: endurance, coordination, and the slow, grinding pressure of a system that no longer needed to rush. That realization shaped everything that came next. By 1918, the German army still existed on paper as a formidable force. Millions of men were still under arms. Trenches still held, artillery still fired, orders were still issued, stamped, and delivered down the chain of command. From a distance, the structure of the army looked intact. Up close, it felt hollow. Imagine a German infantryman in the spring of 1918. He is not new to the war. He has survived years of it. He has fought on the Western Front through bombardments that shook the ground for days at a time. He has watched comrades disappear into shell craters, vanish under artillery fire, or die slowly in aid stations overwhelmed by casualties. He remembers 1914? Back then, the war had felt purposeful, hard, frightening, but bounded by belief. He had marched with confidence, convinced that discipline, training, and sacrifice would bring victory. Officers spoke of decisive battles. Newspapers promised resolution. Even the suffering felt meaningful because it pointed toward an end. Now, that belief is gone. Food is the most immediate problem. Rations have been cut again and again. Bread is darker, mixed with substitutes that barely resemble flour. Meat is rare. Hunger is constant, not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but the dull, persistent emptiness that never quite leaves. Soldiers trade stories about food with an intensity that once belonged to discussions of strategy or leave. Letters from home make it worse. Families write about shortages, about children growing thin, about wives standing in lines for hours only to return empty-handed. The blockade has reached beyond the front lines and into kitchens and bedrooms. The soldier is no longer fighting to protect home from invasion. He is fighting while knowing home is already suffering. That knowledge corrodes morale. Equipment shortages compound the strain. Boots are worn thin, uniforms are patched repeatedly, ammunition exists, but not always when needed. Replacement troops arrive younger, less trained, visibly unsure. The experienced soldiers see it immediately. They know these replacements will not last long in an assault. Officers are different now too. Many of the men who commanded with confidence earlier in the war are gone, killed, wounded, or broken by years of strain. Their replacements are often competent, but exhausted. Orders are still given, but they feel less connected to reality. Attacks are launched without clear objectives. Defensive positions are held even when they are tactically useless. The soldier senses the shift before it is ever acknowledged officially. He notices that victories feel temporary. Advances gained at terrible cost are abandoned days later. Positions taken with enthusiasm are surrendered quietly when counterattacks come. Nothing sticks. Nothing accumulates into progress. The spring offensive briefly rekindles something. For a moment, movement returns to the battlefield. Trenches are overrun. Prisoners are taken. The enemy retreats. The soldier feels something close to hope again, not triumph, but the possibility that this effort might finally matter. But the hope fades quickly. Supplies lag behind the advance. Food does not arrive. Ammunition runs short. The pace exhausts men already running on empty. Elite stormtrooper units take horrific losses. The soldier watches the best fighters disappear first. He realizes something unsettling. This offensive is not being sustained. There is no second wave of strength behind it. No deep reserve waiting to exploit success. What he sees instead is desperation disguised as momentum. Morale fractures quietly, not dramatically. There are no mass desertions yet, no open rebellion, but the tone changes. Soldiers complain openly in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier. Jokes turn bitter. Orders are followed, but without conviction. Men do what they must, not because they believe, but because habit and discipline still carry them forward. The soldier begins to measure survival differently. Earlier in the war, survival meant staying alive until victory. Now, survival means staying alive until the end, whatever that end might look like. He no longer asks when Germany will win. He asks how long this can possibly continue. News from the rear deepens the sense of unraveling. Strikes, food riots, political unrest. Rumors circulate faster than official information. Soldiers piece together a picture of a country under strain, held together by inertia rather than confidence. The state feels distant, abstract, issuing demands without offering reassurance. Belief erodes not because of ideology, but because of exhaustion. The soldier has no grand political theory. He does not debate socialism or monarchy in the trenches. His world has narrowed to immediate concerns: food, rest, survival, and the welfare of the men beside him. The war's original purpose has faded into irrelevance. What remains is endurance, and even that is failing. When Allied counterattacks begin later in the year, the soldier notices something new. The enemy does not rush recklessly anymore. Attacks are deliberate, coordinated, backed by overwhelming material support. Fresh American units appear awkward, inexperienced perhaps, but numerous and well supplied. The imbalance is unmistakable. For the first time, the soldier senses that time itself is against him. Every week brings fewer supplies. Every battle costs men who cannot be replaced. Every letter from home confirms that the civilian population is nearing collapse. The war is no longer something happening over there. It has consumed everything. Yet still, the army holds, because armies do not collapse instantly. They fray, they thin, they lose coherence, one decision at a time. The soldier continues to fight, not because he believes in victory, but because stopping feels impossible. Discipline remains, fear remains, habit remains. But belief, the invisible force that sustains endurance, has quietly slipped away. This is what war exhaustion looks like at the individual level. Not cowardice, not betrayal, but the slow realization that effort no longer leads anywhere. Armies collapse when belief disappears before manpower does. When soldiers still stand in line, still carry rifles, still occupy trenches, but no longer see a future worth reaching. By 1918, many German soldiers were still alive, still armed, still fighting. But inside, the war was already ending. They just did not yet know how. By late summer of 1918, the war no longer moved forward in measured advances. It unraveled. What had begun as a German gamble in the spring now collapsed into a series of Allied counteroffensives that came faster than German command structures could absorb. These were not reckless assaults. They were coordinated, deliberate, and relentless, combining artillery, infantry, tanks, and air support in ways the exhausted German army could no longer match. At places like Amiens, the illusion finally shattered. German positions that had held for years gave way in hours. Entire units surrendered. Prisoners were taken in numbers that stunned Allied commanders. For the first time since the early months of the war, momentum shifted decisively not because of a single breakthrough, but because resistance no longer cohered. German retreats followed, sometimes orderly, often not. Rail lines were damaged. Supply depots were abandoned. Communication broke down as officers struggled to keep track of units moving backward faster than orders could reach them. The army did not collapse overnight, but it no longer recovered from losses. Each retreat made the next one harder to stop. What made this moment different was not simply military pressure. It was that the state behind the army was coming apart at the same time. Inside Germany, civilian hardship reached a breaking point. Years of blockade had hollowed out the home front. Food shortages worsened. Inflation eroded wages. Public patience, already thin, snapped under the weight of continued sacrifice without hope of victory. Strikes spread across industrial centers. Workers walked out not just for food, but for an end to the war. Political parties that had supported the conflict fractured. Calls for reform turned into demands for change. The sense of inevitability reversed. For 4 years, Germans had been told endurance would bring reward. Now endurance itself felt pointless. The Navy revealed this most clearly. In October, German naval commanders ordered a final sortie, a last, symbolic confrontation with the British fleet. It was meant to restore honor, to salvage meaning from defeat. Sailors refused. Mutinies broke out in ports like Kiel. Crews seized ships, red flags were raised. What began as protests spread rapidly, not because sailors were ideologues, but because they no longer accepted orders that promised only death without purpose. This mattered enormously. Navies are instruments of state authority. When they stop obeying, it signals something deeper than discontent. It signals that the state's monopoly on force is failing. Events accelerated. Workers and soldiers' councils formed across German cities, echoing developments earlier in Russia. Local authorities hesitated. Central leadership vacillated. Power fragmented downward faster than anyone could control. At the top, reality finally intruded. Military leaders informed civilian authorities that the front could not be stabilized. The army could still fight but not win. Continuing the war risked not just defeat, but revolution. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, faced an impossible position. His authority had already eroded. Responsibility for the war's direction had shifted repeatedly between civilian and military leadership. Now, his presence itself became a liability. Keeping him on the throne threatened negotiations. Removing him offered at least the possibility of ending the conflict. On the 9th of November, 1918, Wilhelm abdicated. 2 days later, representatives of the German government signed the armistice. At the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. But the war did not end because armies were annihilated. It ended because systems failed faster than armies could fight. Command structures collapsed. Civil authority fractured. Belief evaporated. The machinery that sustained war, obedience, legitimacy, coordination ground to a halt. The front lines still existed. Soldiers still stood in uniform. Weapons still functioned. What no longer functioned was the state's ability to demand continued sacrifice. This is how modern wars end. Not always with conquest. Not always with surrender on the battlefield. But when the institutions that sustain violence can no longer compel it. By November of 1918, the war had exhausted not just nations, but the systems that made nations capable of waging war at all. By 1918, the war reached its final truth. Germany's last gamble, bold, innovative, tactically impressive, failed, not because it lacked skill, but because it demanded more endurance than the system behind it could provide. The spring offensive showed that even brilliance on the battlefield could not overcome exhaustion at home, fractured command, and a collapsing economy. Endurance outlasted innovation. The Allies did not win through a single decisive blow. They survived. They absorbed the shock. They coordinated, replenished, and waited for imbalance to turn into advantage. When the counteroffensives came, they revealed how thin the German war effort had become strong enough to fight, but no longer strong enough to recover. Defeat, in the end, did not arrive as a dramatic surrender. It arrived as collapse. Military retreat merged with political unraveling. Strikes replaced rallies, mutinies replaced obedience. Authority slipped away from institutions that could no longer command belief. The Kaiser's abdication was not the cause of the war's end, it was the confirmation that the state itself had fractured. The armistice silenced the guns, but it did not resolve the forces that had driven the war. Millions were displaced. Empires were shattered. Economies were broken. Expectations were confused. The war stopped not with clarity, but with exhaustion. And that matters, because how a war ends shapes what follows. In the next episode, we move from battlefields to negotiating tables, from armies to diplomats, from violence to language, and the uneasy belief that words could repair what war had destroyed. We'll follow the end of the fighting into the peace that followed, examining how victory, resentment, fear, and idealism collided in the years immediately after the armistice. The war ends, but its consequences begin. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.